Jules Rimet still gleaming. Welcome to the Stiles Council, your fortnightly dose of all things England. My name is David Hartrick. Joining me, as ever, is my faithful companion, Chris Nee. How are you, Chris?
Hello, yes, very good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad, not too bad. We keep this pod sort of fairly short. We try to keep it coming in at 30 to 35 minutes, and the first couple of subjects are very sad for very different reasons, as you'll find out. But there's only one place to sort of start, really, in our news section, and that is with, of course, the very sad death of Ray Wilkins. Chris, genuine England legend, really?
Yeah, there's basically no two ways about that, is there? It's very sad. He's gone far too young, and it was so sudden as well. But it's been sort of quite nice looking back at an England career that I basically missed out on because of my age. I probably wouldn't have guessed 84 caps before last week. And the fact that he played in 82 and 86 World Cups, having been selected for the first time in 76, which was right at the tail end of our horrible spell of non-qualification.
Yeah.
And the fact that his 3 England goals contained that very special goal that I'm sure we'll come on to, just means that it's the legend nature of him in an England shirt. I don't think is necessarily widely appreciated, and certainly I would have been in that number myself before he passed away, sadly.
Yeah, I remember the very tail end of Ray Wilkins, the England player, and I knew he'd played an awful lot. I knew if you'd have asked me before last week, I'd have probably taken a stab at 50 to 60 caps.
Yeah,
but
same.
80 odd is, I don't care who you are or where you play on the pitch. If you get over 80 caps for your national team, that is an incredible record. It really is. He's done that over a 12-year span as well. 12-year span, something like that. And the part of the problem he had was, firstly, there were times where he was playing in a midfield at the tail end where they were also having to fit in Glenn Hoddle. And the two of them aren't similar, but there's no denying if you play Wilkins and Hoddle, you're not blessed with an abundance of pace. And you're also, they got maligned a little bit because they would keep the ball. Yeah, that's sort of so ingrained in both of their DNA that a sideways pass was just as effective to them as trying to Gerrard the ball over 40 yards out of touch to a winger. So he got quite a bit of stick at the back end of his England career. It's where the nickname the Crab came from, playing for England. And I wouldn't say the red card defined his career, but obviously in the 1986 World Cup, he had an incident that was so incredibly un-Ray Wilkins like.
Yeah.
And just to sort of describe it, we're playing against Morocco, a game in absolutely searing heat. England were labouring, as you might expect, and he throws the ball basically at something. The ball goes out for
it's offside. He was given offside.
Was it an offside call? I can't remember if it was offside or if they'd given a throw in when he thought he kept it in play. But yeah, offside. And he throws the ball and it hits. Is it the linesman or the referee?
No,
it hits? Sorry,
he throws the ball at is too strong. I think he throws the ball at the referee's feet. But it was such a strange incident because it's in those when you hear about it, you expect to watch the footage and he gets the call against him, picks the ball up straight away, turns and throws it at the referee. It seems to take absolutely ages before he even picks the ball up, and then he sort of throws it to the feet of the referee. And I would love to be able to say that it's not a red card because it is so soft. It's so soft, but the referee absolutely read the intention correctly, because it wasn't innocent, but I don't know. I wouldn't want any player sent off for that, really.
No, and you can see. I've not watched the incident before we've done this pod again, and I should have done, really. But the other thing I remember about that game is I've never seen a player as instantly regret something in my life. There's that. When he gets the actual red card, you can see he's just absolutely gutted.
Yeah.
But then there's
I watched it today. He's sort of physically underneath the card at the time it comes out.
And there's that quite famous footage of where he walks off and goes jumps over the advertising ordinance, and he's sort of walking round, and he's just he's devastated, because playing for England for Wilkins was a huge thing, and that was genuinely a point where he felt like, and he'd spoke about it since, he felt like he'd let the whole country down, and he really felt the weight of that moment. So, yeah, incredibly sad. Gone way too soon as well. I always really liked him as a pundit. I liked that he had. To me, Chris, he was somebody who could speak with authority, and I never questioned it. It's not. If he'd told me, well, I don't understand that because I'd never played the game. If Ray Wilkins said that, do you know what? I'd actually be quite happy to just take that on the chin. Whereas, if Robbie Savage said that to me, I would take him to task big time.
And he would.
And I think it's worth talking about that goal. If you haven't seen this goal before, you are clearly not on Twitter. But if for the one or two people that haven't, it's during the 1980 European Championships. It's a very young Ray Wilkins. Ball comes out to the edge of the box, bobbling round. But it's against a Belgium side who they were terrible at the time. Absolutely terrible. And Wilkins, basically, they're sort of trying to come out. It's almost like they're trying to play. Half of them are trying to play offside, and half of them are just become suddenly aware that they're way too deep. And so they come charging out, and Wilkins just basically lobs an entire back line, runs onto it. But then the best thing about that goal, Chris, for me, is he stops. He runs onto it, and he literally stops, and he just takes the last step. He's just walking, and he just side foot lobs it over the goalkeeper, who's completely stranded, and just takes a couple of steps off with his arm in the air. Just a brilliant goal, isn't it?
It's superb. It's the finish for me. It's the vision to take the ball over the defence was one thing, but to then watch that ball bounce and then knock it over the keeper as well was quite something. It's a genuinely special goal, and it's an insight for people like me as well. Because for me, Wilkins was the little balding fella who looked older than everybody else at QPR.
Yeah. Listen, that is completely fair, because there will be people listening to this, Chris, for whom Ray Wilkins is the bloke who every time he co-commentated called every player by their first name.
Yeah.
Peter will be disappointed with that. But it's easy to lose sight sometimes that the phrase I always go back to is the fact that for probably 4, 5, maybe even 6 generations of football fans now, Gary Lineker is a TV host. Yeah, and to me and you, he will always be an England striker, no matter how many episodes of Match of the Day he does. And Ray Wilkins is a bit like that. But on our other podcast, we've talked before about being able to look back at your career and your list of clubs and think, I've done a bit. And you look at Wilkins, Chelsea for 6 years, where he was captain at 19 years old as well, by the way.
Yes.
Captain. Man United for 5 years and way more games than I remembered.
Yeah, it's north of 100 league games, wasn't he?
Yeah. He's well over 150, Chris, for Man United. And he scored a wonderful goal in the 1983 Cup final, which we'll not talk about and move straight on, being a Brighton fan. But then 3 seasons in Milan where he is extremely well thought of. And he pretty much played as a defensive midfielder, and he was playing in front of Baresi there. Little sojourn to Paris with PSG, then a very memorable spell up in Rangers where he was basically ever present for 2 seasons. Only scored 2 goals, both of them worldies, and then back to QPR for a long spell as player and player manager and coach, and went out on loan a couple of times. And when they sort of let him go, he was one of those who sort of couldn't quite give it up. He had a few games up in Scotland and a few games back with. I may be wrong, but I'm pretty sure he had 1 or 2 games for Millwall. He just couldn't quite give it up. And then, of course, coach for a long time. Coach with your own dear Villa for a long time. So, yeah, I think sometimes the word legend is overplayed, but I think in Wilkins' case, I think we can both agree that both an England legend in terms of this podcast and an English footballing legend in terms of entire contribution, really, Chris.
Yep, big loss. Very, very sad.
Extremely sad news. As I said, this is going to be sad for a very different reason. But as we do this podcast, we want to look at sort of the entirety of England's history, really, in pocket-sized chunks, and we'll go into specific games at some point. We'll go into specific people, as we do with the player wall, but we'll also, in our sort of discussion part, talk about why Owen Hargreaves does not get the recognition he deserves. But we're going to look at, because we are nothing if not masochists, we're going to look at England specifically at Euro 2000. This still hurts me, Chris. There is one game here that is still incredibly tough to talk about.
Yes.
But I think we'll go on a game-by-game basis. I think that's the easiest way to do it. So, England drawn into Group A, and it's a tough group. Germany, Romania, Portugal, and England. Okay, and obviously top 2 through. You look at that on paper and you think, "Phew, yeah, that's as tough as it gets." But when you start to scratch the surface a bit, it's not quite as tough as you may think, and it's a real missed opportunity, a real body blow. This. So the first game in the group was the Germany 1-1 with Romania, wasn't it? If I remember rightly.
Yep.
They played at tea time, and then we came on at 8:00 against Portugal. In a game that we had a really good side, and Portugal had a few names that you knew, but not necessarily a brilliant side. So they had that João Pinto, Gomes and Figo front three with Rui Costa feeding them. But beyond that, there wasn't much there, was there, Chris? When you look at an England side that had Shearer, Owen, McManaman, Ince, Scholes, Beckham, and Gary Neville Gary Neville played very, very well at this tournament. The left back, who he may or may not have been related to, did not, but we'll go into that. But talk me through that first 20 minutes first, Chris.
Well, all of those players you've just mentioned started the game against Portugal in Eindhoven. And when you talk about scratching the surface, what we have is Romania as the weakest side, one you would hope that most England teams would be able to better in a tournament like this, a Germany team that we would beat, and a Portugal team who we were 2-0 up on within 20 minutes of the start of that game.
And all over, it should be said. Yeah. All over them.
Flying, exactly as you should. Like a front group of Scholes, McManaman, Shearer and Owen should be all over a team.
Proper Keegan ball this was for 20 minutes. Proper Keegan ball.
And it was... I naively thought we had it sewn up at that point. And it only took 3 minutes to take the lead. It was Beckham, wasn't it, crossed it to Scholes?
Yep.
A thumping header in off the bar.
Yep.
And it was just one-way traffic for the next sort of 15 minutes before we scored again. And again, Beckham created it from the right wing. And this was McManaman scoring with one of the easier finishes of his career, really. And after 20 minutes, England 2 up, weakish Germany, Romania 4th best in the group. We fell apart.
Yeah. 19th minute, I was sat there thinking, I tell you what, we've got a massive chance in this tournament. 37th minute, I was sat there thinking, we're going to struggle to get out this group. That's how much of a roller coaster this game was. Figo scores what is a brilliant goal, but our defensive two just sit back and sit back and sit back, and they basically give a player who was, without a shadow of doubt, in the top 2 or 3 in world football at that point in his career, the entirety of the half to run into, cut inside and take the shot on. And that has always annoyed me. As good as that goal is, I mean, he's just had so much space, didn't he, Chris? I mean, where was Ince coming back as cover there?
He did, yeah. No cover from Ince, and the back two were not covering themselves in glory either. And, you know, unfortunately, I've got Sol Campbell as responsible for goal number 2 as well, for the João Pinto diving header.
Yeah.
For me, he shouldn't have even had the chance to score.
It just doesn't react, does he, Campbell? He just doesn't. He doesn't read it at all, which, for Sol Campbell, that's extremely unusual thing to say.
The other one's Tony Adams as well, so I think we've got every right to be disappointed in them, frankly. Good players. There was no, outside of the left back, there was no real weak spot in that starting lineup, and the way they sort of folded when Portugal really started to come at us was extremely disheartening.
Yeah, obviously, we have to get through this in a certain amount of time, but I think there's a couple of things that I want to mention here, Chris. The first is that Portugal played 2 in front of their back 4, Vidigal and possibly Bento. And England in the second half could not break them down at all. I mean, there was just no invention. They seemed to have an extra man every single time we got the ball. And this was a little bit basketball from England at the time. It was quite a regimented 4-4-2. And we really struggled against what was a pretty continental system at the time. But the other thing, Chris, was there an indication of why we failed in the subs? Because you look at that starting lineup, and besides that left back who may or may not be related to Gary Neville, that was an incredibly strong side. But you look at the subs we brought on at the time, and it was a young Emil Heskey came on just after half-time. Dennis Wise came on with over half an hour to go, and Martin Keown came on right at the very, very end. Was it strong first 11, weak squad overall?
It wasn't a vintage squad, was it? I think I'm quite happy with Martin Keown as an England international in a tournament. I have no problem with that. And I don't mean this as disrespectfully as it sounds, but Dennis Wise, to me, is a step down from the players who started that game, and I think that's relatively obvious. Heskey in himself, I don't necessarily think he's a signifier of anything too significant, particularly. He, in those days, and actually, in the following year, he would go on to have his highest point for England. He was an impressive young player. However, he's not Alan Shearer.
Yeah, this is the problem, isn't it, with Heskey? It's not that he was a bad player, but you look at the crop of strikers we had, and I go from Shearer right through to Sheringham. Heskey was sort of the antithesis of so much of what made the other strikers brilliant. And there was, of course, it was this very trendy thing to say, well, it's because he makes other players better. Shearer didn't need any help to be any better, did he? he was all right on his own, if I'm completely honest. Yeah. Same for Michael Owen, who was bloody brilliant for England, and I won't have anybody say a word against him. We'll get on to Michael Owen's England career at some point.
Yeah, we will. Heskey was... I don't know that Heskey had quite grown into the player that makes other players better by this point. I think we were still talking about him as having a really serious potential as a striker in his own right.
I don't think he was ready for a tournament at this point, Chris. But we'll get. So then we lose the Portugal game 3-2, and it was a real that second half was a real morale sapper, really.
Yeah, should we call it a slog?
Yeah, we were outplayed, and the third goal from Gomes, I've never seen a more inevitable winner coming in my life. But then we move on to match day 2, Romania Portugal. Portugal beat Romania with a not just a last minute goal, it was basically the very last kick of the game. I can't remember who scored, Chris. I'm sorry, I should have looked that up.
No, I've done a pretty good job of blanking out the other games in this group, really.
Well, I can't. Forgive me, whoever scored, but I just remember it was almost the last kick of the game. But then England versus Germany, which is the game that before the tournament everybody was building up to. Everybody said this is what it's all about. Everybody said this is England's best chance to beat them. And the first thing to know is that Keegan made a couple of changes. So Adams came out and Keown came in. But McManaman, I think, if memory serves, was carrying a little bit of a knock, so Dennis Wise came in on the left. And this was basketball. It was 4-4-2 against a Germany side that, I mean, it's easy to look back and say, well, this was a terrible Germany side and we were lucky to beat them. They had Lothar Matthäus playing as sweeper at the time, and I believe he was just over his 1,000th birthday. But you had Babel and Novotny, who were both good in defence. Diesler and Ziege each side. Hamann and Jens Jeremies, I always thought was a really good, intelligent midfielder. But it was that Scholl, Janker and Kirsten sort of attacking triumvirate that really didn't fill you with the sort of fear that previous German attacks had. You know, there's no Klinsmann, is there? Or someone like that who's really going to scare you. So we go into this game with a reasonable amount of confidence, and I'll let you talk for a little bit about it now, Chris, but I will say, I know we won, but it was an absolute stinker, wasn't it?
One of the worst games I've ever seen. And that's not to say I didn't enjoy it, because I did enjoy it. I love Germany, but I love beating Germany even more. And that was quite enough for me at the time. And I felt it was a bit of a turnaround from the Portugal game, but it was a terrible football match. And not a vintage England performance either, you know, within that context. I had no fear of Germany going into this game. It's a game that became a watershed for them. And we've kind of kept bumbling along, and arguably still haven't stopped bumbling along. And in another universe, it's possible that it might have gone another way and we might have had a look at ourselves instead. So it kind of has that feel of a match that meant something to Germany because they were the losers. And we just kind of took it and ran with it, got knocked out, and all was lost. But it was very enjoyable to win the game. The goal was a decent finish, inventive finish. We'll call it an inventive finish.
Yeah,
Shearer header. But that was really the only thing between the teams. It was just deadlock.
There was just a load of harrying midfielders. It was one of those games that seemed to be virtually completely played out in the sort of 15 yards either side of the halfway line for both teams, and it was as I said, I think this was a watershed moment for Germany, as you say, but that German team wasn't anywhere near as bad as some would have you believe. I think what it was for Germany is that they realised that they couldn't just keep relying on the same old techniques, the same old tactics and the same old production lines to get the results they had got up until that point. And for England, we just we had this sort of mix of younger players and experienced players, and like I remember Scholes in that game thinking, right, Scholes is going to be massive in this game because there's going to be a load of space, and he is going to be up against 4,008-year-old Lothar Matthäus at times, because Matthäus will step out to mark him as he comes in late. This is a big game for Scholes, and it was just a nothing game from him. It was just, I'm not saying that was his fault, because the whole game was a nothing game, but it was just a lot of sideways passes, probing ball, move breaks down, ball ends up back in midfield, and it was a win's a win.
Yeah, well,
as to say.
Just on Scholes, he had his opportunity to not play on the left for England in that game.
Yeah,
and he as you say, he's not responsible for it entirely on his own, but he was bogged down just like the rest of them.
Yeah, I mean, he started central in the Portugal game, and the problem was he wanted to play. He wanted that diamond in midfield, so he wanted Ince behind him, providing the cover, so that he could do what Paul Scholes does, and Ince just didn't do it, basically. In this game, the two of them were sort of, it was like they were tied at the wrist, really. They were just playing in that pocket in midfield, and it was great to beat Germany, but it all just felt a little bit flat, didn't it, Chris?
Certainly did, yeah. It was kind of such a non-event on the field, and beating them didn't feel like it had been difficult. They didn't have the sense of occasion that beating them in Euro '96 would have, for example.
Yeah, that's it. That's exactly it. And it just felt flat. So we go into the last game against Romania, the supposed weakest opponents in this group. England 3 points from that Germany win. Portugal sat on 6 points. They're going through. Romania sat on 1 point that they got from the draw against Germany. So Romania have to win. England just need the draw.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, in terms of disappointing England performances, this is well up there. So start with the team, Chris. First, there was the change in goal. So Nigel Martin comes in. The back four is Gary Neville's less talented brother at left back. Keonan Campbell in the middle. Gary Neville on the right. Midfield, Wise, Ince, Scholes, Beckham, and Owen and Shearer up front. Against a Romania team who were okay. I mean, they had a very young Adrian Mutu up front. They had Moldovan next to him, who was a very jobbing striker, wasn't he? I mean, he was all right. He was okay. There were a few other names you'd know. Ili, Dan Petrescu was playing in midfield, I think, for this game. Christian Kivu. Kivu was an excellent left back, wasn't he? To be fair, he was a very good player. Popescu was captain, but apart from that, not an awful lot. And England here, a point was so within their grasp that it's absolutely ridiculous. But Chris, just you go for a minute, 'cause I'm just starting to get depressed all over again.
Well, it has a similarity to the Portugal game in that, to a certain extent, the expectations change. In Portugal case, from kick-off to the point where we're 2-0 up, it looks a different game. And suddenly there's absolutely no excuse whatsoever for losing that match. Against Romania, we got ourselves 2-1 up. And from that point, to not be able to secure a draw to get through and knock them out, it's just absolutely unacceptable. And they went in front. Kivu scored the first goal for them, and it was a cross.
Yeah, and it was... I think it's worth saying that the game, England should have started on the front foot, and the game had been actually pretty even until this point. Romania had, I think, surprised some of that England side. Now, I don't know, I've no insight whatsoever into what Keegan had told them in the dressing room, but I suspect that they hadn't paid them enough attention, because England started that game looking like a side who knew they were going to go through. Now, sometimes that is a good thing, that confidence and that arrogance actually works for you. It did not work for England in any way, shape or form in this game. And that Kiva goal, yeah, fair enough. It was coming, to be frank. Shearer then gets us back in with the penalty.
Yep.
And
last
Michael
England
Owen,
goal?
You are, sorry?
His last England goal?
Yeah, which is one of the most unfitting ends to a career. I mean, it's up there with Gary Lineker, isn't it, in terms of just a terrible way to finish a brilliant career. Michael Owen scored I thought, very good finish.
Yeah, classic Owen.
As a member of the Strikers Union, as you know, Chris, I think that's a very good finish. Then straight after half-time, it was 2-2. And let's talk about the penalty, okay? You cover it, because I'll just end up talking about Phil Neville.
Well, being in the last minute didn't help. It was a Phil Neville foul on Moldovan, I think, if I remember correctly.
Who was going nowhere.
He was going nowhere. He fouled him for 10, 15 yards. And he waited until he got into the box to bring him down. That's the bit that disappointed me. Fouled him in the wrong place. And you know what? Paul Ince was covering as well.
It was a terrible piece of decision making. He was a young footballer at the time. It's easy to forgive some of the naiveties, really, but it was just such a staggeringly poor piece of decision making. To like you say, he was all over him in a dangerous part of the pitch, but then like you say, he gets into the box. He's going nowhere. I mean, he's running the ball out to touch, isn't he?
Yeah, more or less. So Ince is there to make sure he does. Yeah,
he's going down a complete blind alley, and Neville lunges in with the tackle is just, the timing of it is just so terrible. He goes with the wrong leg, he goes at the wrong time, and it is one of the most, I mean, it's one of those penalties. It's two penalties, isn't it? It's three penalties, if anything.
Yeah, it was desperation. It was created by desperation. It was executed through desperation. It was panic. And the only thing I will say in favour of Phil Neville in this situation is that I was panicking too, but I'm a supporter. I'm not on the pitch. Yeah.
And then Ganea scores the penalty.
Yeah.
And England are
cool as you like, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah, brilliant pen. And England are out at the same time as Germany are getting absolutely battered by Portugal. It was, I think that game was, I think it finished 3-0 or something like that, but they played with, rather than playing with Mateus as a sweeper, they played him as like just a normal central defender. And it wouldn't have been Gomez, actually. It might have been, I can't remember who played up front that night, but they absolutely ran him ragged. So England out, and it was just that for me, Chris, is one of my most depressing England nights, and there have been several depressing England nights. There's not, I don't know if this is still slight bitterness talking and pain, but I actually don't think we could pull any real positive from that campaign, even the win against Germany, because it was such a bad game against a team who, as we would find out, were absolutely there for the taking. Yeah. So, overall, utterly miserable, yeah?
Yeah, it was. And just to recap, the starting lineup for the first game was Seaman, Neville, Adams, Campbell, Neville, Beckham, Ince, Scholes, McManaman, and Shearer, Owen. There is no excuse.
Yeah. No excuse whatsoever. Right, let's cheer ourselves up by putting a player on the player wall.
Come on.
I'm hosting this week, so it's my turn. I've put up Paul Gascoigne, which was completely obvious. I've put up Owen Hargreaves because personally I just absolutely loved him as an England player. I'm putting up somebody now whose England career pretty pretty maligned, really. Very, very underrated. But to be frank, he never really let us down and scored some brilliant and very important goals for us, and that's Joe Cole. When he obviously came onto the scene, everybody jokes about it now, but he was the future of English football. But he just looked so different, and all the Gascoigne comparisons that came, nobody compares to Paul Gascoigne, but the Gascoigne comparisons, they were based in something, because he was just so unafraid, and I've talked about it on another podcast, but I'll never forget the first time I properly sat up and thought, hang on a sec, was a game which West Ham won when they played against Arsenal. Arsenal played in the yellow kit, and he ran Vieira ragged, but memorably in the centre circle, he nutmegged Vieira, and Vieira ended up on his arse. And he was, I mean, at the time he would have been, I don't know, maybe 19, 20, and it was just, hang on, we've massively got one here. Comes into the England side, and it's an England side that doesn't necessarily have a natural home for a player of his talent, to be honest with you. So as England tend to do with these players, he has to sort of spend some of his England career as a round peg in very much a square hole. And it was very difficult for him to sort of come off the leash, really. But his big contribution for me was he scored 10 goals for England. And I've said it before, but if you're going to score 10 goals for England, Joe Cole's 10 goals are are where you want to be. I run a Twitter account called One Ball for Gaza with Adam Hurrey, and we've got a moment up there which is Joe Cole's 10 goals for England, and all barring one, really, they are all really, really good goals. It's not just about that goal against Sweden, which was like, I mean,
it's top five England goals, that is.
Yeah, because the thing about the Sweden goal is to hit the shot from there and to hit it that high and to get it into the top corner is like, technique-wise, is just, it's really, I mean, it's up there with, that's the sort of level of goal that there's only like a handful of players in the world at any one time can actually score, and without basically just leathering the ball. To actually mean to do that is just unbelievable. But yeah, he scored some brilliant goals for England. There's one that got, I think, deflected against Wales, but apart from that, his last couple against Andorra are both brilliant.
His first,
and was it? That's the
free kick against Serbia and Montenegro.
The free kick against Serbia, yeah, where that wall is not 10 yards back either. It's about 8 yards back, and it's just a brilliant free kick. And then he scored again a couple of months later against Denmark, I think. And then there's the goal against Northern Ireland, and that game against Northern Ireland at Old Trafford, he was outstanding. Absolutely outstanding. He was. I'd go further and say he was unplayable in that game. I'm not going to sit here and say, he was our best ever player or anything like that. But on his day, he was absolutely superb. The problem was exactly the same problem he had at club level as well. It was very, very difficult to find a position on the pitch that maximised everything he had in terms of his armour. But this is a player who, as an England schoolboy, scored 7 goals in one game against Spain. He had all the talent in the world. It's just, you could make an argument he was born 10 years too late, or you could make an argument he was born 10 years too early. He was just, he never quite fitted in the teams he played in, and not just England. He was really good for Chelsea, but again, they never quite worked out how to get the perfect game from Joe Cole. And And that was, Mourinho at his very best, really.
Yeah.
But what's your take on Joe Cole, Chris?
Well, in spite of that, it would have been signed by Ranieri, I think, wouldn't he? But then obviously Mourinho wasn't too far behind that. Chelsea Joe Cole was my favourite Joe Cole. And the reason for that is that he came through with all this hype at West Ham, played with some style for their first team, and then moved to Chelsea, where he was for like 6 or 7 years. And the little tricky guy at West Ham was one thing, but the fact that he was able to adapt ever so slightly so that he was still getting games and still giving performances at Mourinho's Chelsea made him this strong and direct and clever and aggressive attacking threat that was really special for Chelsea. And I agree that becoming that player took some of the flair out of his game. But he's still got all the ability in the world. But I see him as a very slightly more functional player than what you would call a flair player, in the sense that he became stronger and more physical and more direct as he got older. And I mean all that. That to me is a good thing, because at his best, which I think was in Mourinho's Chelsea, there was no fat on his game. None of it was for show. He still had the little bits of trickery. He still had the imagination. But it was also a threat because he was being reined in. And I think that's where Mourinho did have a little win with him. Yeah,
I would agree with that. Brilliant. And the thing I love about him is that he's really, since the move to Liverpool, well, really his last sort of maybe... Well, no, really, it was the move to Liverpool that sort of signified the start of his really bad injury problems. And that was 2010. 2017, he's still playing. He's playing for the Tampa Bay Rowdies, still enjoying himself, still scoring goals. And a player who'd sort of been through the mill a bit, but had put the smile back on his face, and I've just got all the affection in the world really for Joe Cole, for what he did for England, and I won't have a word said against him.
Yeah.
We've run a little bit long here, Chris, for one of our episodes.
Surprise.
Yeah, but we've covered quite a bit of ground. We shall speak to you again in another couple of weeks, and we're thoroughly enjoying doing these, so if you can share them round, tell your friends, tell your mates, like, subscribe, all the usuals. Our main sort of Twitter output will be via Sphinx Football, I believe.
Yeah,
Chris?
Sphinx FTBL.
Yeah, so get following that, and your help is greatly received. We shall see you in a couple of weeks then. Say goodbye, Chris.
Goodbye, Chris.
Goodbye, Chris.